Good afternoon, I'm the Modern Warfare historian and welcome to our first battle special. Considering that our main YouTube series for now is Warfare Room Operation Season 1, we think that it is correct to analyze in detail a battle connected to the Papua New Guinea campaign. Therefore, we will start with the first naval battle of Savo Island. Before we start to talk about the battle, it is logical that we take a look at the situation on both sides at this moment in time. It is early August and the Japanese advance in the South Pacific has been halted, for now, with some Allied strategic victories. Keep in mind that the Pacific Front was mostly a Navy's war, and the Japanese had received huge crippling blows both at the Battle of Coral Sea and at Midway, losing a lot of very important carriers. The Japanese ground operations, too, were not going very well, since Operation Mo, the planned amphibious invasion of Port Moresby, failed even before the soldiers touched the ground, and since the Crocodile attack campaign, that started on the 21st of July, while going well, was very worrying on the supply side. Worst thing of all, the Allied, especially the Americans, had decided to go on the offensive. In fact, the Americans had just decided to activate Operation Watchtower, the landing at Tulagi and nearby position. Tulagi had been taken in May by the Japanese, and they had started the construction of a seaplane base. However, the main concern was the new airfield being constructed on Guadalcanal Island at Lunga Point, that, if used by long-range bombers, could have caused some damage to Allied shipping from America to Australia and New Zealand. Also, the Japanese had planned Operation FS, the invasion of Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia, and those planes would have provided air cover for the invasion fleet. However, the operation was halted after the defeat at Operation Mo and cancelled after the one at Midway. The Americans' long-term strategy was simple: halt the Japanese in the Kokoda Track in Papua New Guinea, capture the Solomon Island, and work their way north to the Bismarck Archipelago. The Americans assigned part of the 1st Marine Division and part of the 2nd Marine Division for the initial landing that are not the subject of this video, that started on the 7th of August. The Japanese answered with airstrike, but this was not enough, so the Navy was called. Before we look at how the Japanese Navy answered the call, let's see the composition of the Allied fleet. The Allied had two task forces, TF-61 and TF-62. Task Force 61 under Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher had the job to cover the other task forces, and it had 3 fleet carriers, 1 fast battleship, 5 heavy cruiser, 1 anti-air cruiser, 16 destroyer, and 5 fleet oilers. The troops were transported by Task Force 62 under Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, that was divided in 5 groups. Task Force 62.1, the landing group, was divided in 2 subgroups, one for Guadalcanal with 9 transport ships and 6 attack cargo ships, and one for Tulagi with 4 transport ships and 4 destroyer transport. By the way, all these infographics will be available on our website. Be sure to check it out if you are interested. The only thing that I'm not sure about are some tonnages, so take those with a grain of salt. Because of the distance of the 2 islands and for the shape of the naval area, the ships from Task Force 62 assigned as covering forces composed 3 of the 5 groups, and those were Task Force 62.2 Southern Group under Rear Admiral Victor A.C. Crutchley near the island of Guadalcanal with 3 heavy cruiser, 1 light cruiser, and 9 destroyer. Task Force 62.3 Northern Group under Captain Frederick Riefkel near the island of Tulagi with 3 heavy cruiser and 4 destroyer, and Task Force 62.4 Eastern Group under Rear Admiral Norman Scott to cover the eastern flank of the fleet, with 1 anti-aircraft light cruiser and 2 destroyers. Additionally, Task Force 62.5 was composed of 5 fast minesweepers. Against all of these, the Japanese were able to send the newly formed 8th Fleet under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, composed of 5 light cruiser, 2 light cruiser, and a single destroyer. The Rising Sun Navy was in a huge disadvantage, so they had to level the fight to have better odds, and thanks to both luck and skill, they were able to achieve something that was deemed impossible. After the landing, because of the Japanese air raids, Task Force 61 was moved away from the operational area. The Japanese also decided to use the gunnery advantage at night, a fact that was not known by the Allied at the time of the battle. This was because, already in the interwar period, the Japanese recognized that they would be very quickly fighting against a much more numerous enemy with superior technology. Therefore, they needed to do this sort of sneak attack at night, when the enemy was not prepared, a sort of naval guerrilla warfare. Also, it shall be noted that the Japanese had probably the best night spotting equipment in the world, and on screen you can see a 7.5 per 60 binocular, and for those who don't know anything about binoculars and optics in general, Simply put, the bigger the front lens is, the more light it is able to capture and the easier it is to see at night. This is a big simplification, but it's just to give you an idea. However, it shall also be noted that this night fighting strategy was part of the anti-Kessen doctrine that required a decisive field engagement to cripple the enemy and the will to fight, and night fighting was probably one of the only chances for the Japanese to survive against the hordes of enemy planes. This is also because at this time of the war there are plenty of Japanese carriers and pilots on the bottom of the sea, and it was not so easy to coordinate with airplanes, something that we have discussed in Season 1 of Warfare Room Operation. Speaking of the Allied, they were very reliant on their radars at night, and due to their infancy, those were sometimes not very effective. Another reason was also that Task Force 62 assigned only two destroyers as early warning, USS Ralph Talbot and USS Blue, that had uncoordinated patrol patterns that left huge gaps between the ships. Those two destroyers had radars, but they faced only forward, and this meant that because of the uncoordinated pattern of patrols, sometimes the two ships left big zones of sea when facing in opposite direction with no radars checking them. More destroyers were available, but those were left near the transport ship in fear of enemy night submarine attack. On the night of the 8th of August, the commander of Task Force 62.2 was called on a meeting with the commander of Task Force 62 and the commander of the 1st Marine Division to discuss the effect that could be caused by the order to leave the area issued to Task Force 61. At 5:21, therefore, the heavy cruiser HMS Australia left the southern group, leaving the USS Chicago in charge. However, the other cruiser groups were not informed, and this added to the overall confusion that we will see later. During the meeting, the officers also discussed about the Japanese fleet spotted the day before. In fact, the Japanese fleet had been spotted 3 times by the Allied. The first one to spot was the submarine S-38 on the 7th at around 8 p.m. That reported 2 destroyers and 3 larger ships of unknown type. However, the report was considered vague and the size of it did not suggest an impending danger to the Allied fleet. Also, the enemy fleet was not considered a danger because they were spotted near a ball. That was a major Japanese base, and so it was normal to spot enemy cruisers there. The second and third report were done by 2 Australian Hudson, one at 20 past 10 a.m. and the other at 11 a.m. The first report indicated 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers and 2 seaplane tenders, but having the crew not received an acknowledgement for the communication, they returned to base at Milne Bay in order to deliver it. The second Hudson also failed to communicate the finding to the base, reporting 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers and 1 unknown type, but they decided to finish the patrol before returning to base. This will later create some issues and criticism for decades to come, and I'll leave you some sources in the description on the matter. Also, considering the position of where they were spotted and that the first Hudson reported 2 seaplane tenders, this led to the conclusion that the cruiser force was not intended for a surface action, because seaplane tenders tend to not resist a lot against enemy batteries. My guess is that the Allied command took that force as a reconnaissance unit that surveyed what the Allied were up to, or to create another seaplane base, something that would become a danger but not in the immediate time. What is also important to note is that the reports were delivered very late on the 8th, so the Allied Navy did not have an entire day to think on that, just hours. The Navy had requested the Air Force to conduct additional recon operations, but those were not done. However, the Air Force commander did not notify the Navy about the absence of this mission, and the Navy thought that the zone around the operational area had been scouted accordingly. It shall be noted that the Air Force had very few forces in the area, and that Task Force 62 had around 15 scout planes available that were not used, and were left on the deck of the cruiser filled with gasoline, and this would later become quite a big fire hazard on the Allied ship. Last but not least, the Allied crews were general quarters for 2 days, therefore they were fatigued even before the battle commenced, and had to man the battle station at half strength in order to rotate the personnel. The Japanese fleet had a simple plan. Knowing, thanks to floatplane scout planes, that the enemy fleets were divided, the commander decided to defeat them in detail, first concentrating on the northern group and then on the southern one. Near 1 a.m., Mikawa's fleet spotted the USS destroyer USS Blue and had more than 50 guns pointed at her, ready to obliterate her in case she made any strange movement, but this never happened, as the Japanese fleet remained undetected and continued their course at 30 knots. However, the lookouts later spotted USS Ralph Talbot, and Mikawa decided to change his plan, first concentrating on the southern force and then on the northern one. At 31 past 1 a.m., he ordered every ship attack. The destroyer Unagi was dispatched after the Japanese fleet spotted the destroyer USS Jarvis heading away from the combat area, after the American ship had been damaged by aircraft during a raid on the 8th, but the Japanese and the American ship traded shells with no effect. The raid also set ablaze the cargo USS George F. Elliott, and the fire silhouetted the cruiser and the destroyer of the Southern Force, and the Japanese started launching torpedoes. The USS Patterson crew was on alert because her captain had decided to take seriously the report on the Japanese ship, and found strange that they spotted Japanese scout planes above their heads. At 43 past 1 a.m., the American destroyer spotted a cruiser and alerted the rest of the fleet, signaling warning, warning, strange ships entering the harbor, and started firing star shells to illuminate the area. At the same time, Japanese scout planes above the American fleet started to drop flares on the enemy to make friendly gunnery easier. The HMS Canberra reacted to contact by increasing speed and turning to port. However, quick salvos of precise Japanese fire from Chokai and Furutaka, and later Aoba and Kako, gripped the breach and boiler rooms, killing the gunnery officer and mortally wounding the captain. Also, the ship's electrical system were out, and it started to take water and to list on the starboard side, unable to pump out the water due to having no electrical power. The loss of power also prevented her from signaling the other ships nearby. The HMS Canberra suffered a total of 24 large caliber hits. Due to differences in procedure, especially in crew management when the general quarters were assigned between the Australian Navy, modeled after the British Navy, and their American counterpart, the OC crews were able to react faster than their Star and Stripe colleagues. And this explains why the USS Chicago was almost a sitting duck compared to HMS Canberra in the first crucial moment of the engagement. Luckily for the Americans, the Japanese were aiming at the Canberra at first, but this did not mean that the Chicago would survive undamaged. USS Chicago was hit by a torpedo on the bow, and the second one failed to explode, while a high-caliber shell hit her mast, killing 2 sailors. She moved westwards, away from the combat area and from the transport ship that she was meant to protect, and was able to fire only her secondary battery at Tenryu, probably hitting her and making some casualties, but no important damage. Worst things of all, the Chicago's captain did not inform the other ship in the area of the Japanese fleet, nor it tried to organize a formation, and it is worth to remember that technically the Chicago was in charge of the southern group. USS Patterson tried to engage in a gun duel, and it is unknown if she hit something, but in return she received a shell and 10 sailors died. USS Bagley fired a salvo of 2 torpedoes, missing the Japanese fleet, and it is not clear, probably even hitting the Canberra, and this would explain why the Australian ship was leading to the starboard side, while the enemy fleet was on the port side. Another possible explanation for the Canberra's list was that because of the very short range involved, probably the shells entering the port side were exiting on the starboard side under the waterline. However, I and a lot of people before me were not able to confirm one of the two because of the very limited amount of proofs on the matter, and probably we will, sadly, never know. The Japanese fleet steered north, splitting into columns, probably unintentionally. For the Japanese, half the battle had already been won easily. Now they had to fight an enemy alerted and ready, or not. The crews in the northern ship group had observed the fighting south, but were very slow to mend their position. The Astoria called general quarters at 11:02 a.m., 6 minutes after the fighting began. The ship opened fire, but a ceasefire was ordered by the captain, who had just awakened from his sleep, thinking that those were friendly forces. Less than a minute later, the order was revoked, but that precious time gave the Japanese enough time to range the ship, and the Astoria was hit multiple times and set ablaze. Remember when earlier we talked about the elite seaplanes being full of fuel and that it was a big fire hazard? Well, the Americans found their ship ablaze mostly for this reason. Astoria was left dead in the water with no electricity badly needed for the firefighting equipment. She was able to return fire and hit Shokai forward further, damaging the ship and putting the gun out of action. Astoria was hit multiple times, probably about 40 or 50 hits. USS Quincy suffered a similar fate, being hit by 54 shell and 2 torpedoes from Tenryu. The American ship was able to fire back at Shokai, destroying the chart room and killing or wounding 36 sailors, but in return she was hit at 10 past 2 a.m. on the bridge. Interesting to know are 2 things. First, the shell almost killed Mikawa, as the chart room was around 20 feet near where he was. Second, it is interesting to note the different amount of damage that the other shell caused compared to the ones dealt by the Japanese. And my guess is this because the Japanese had less armor than the Allied had, and that the Allies had better damage control equipment and training. However, I am not sure about the armor thing as I don't have armor layout of the Japanese cruiser, and also I am not sure how much damage were caused in the first place. Therefore, it is impossible, with sources that I have at the moment, to conclude if the damage control inferiority played any major role in the fact that the Japanese took a lot of damage, while the Allied ship proved themselves as more resilient to enemy damage. With almost all her bridge crew killed, including the captain, she was basically lost. Another torpedo hit her at 16 past 2 a.m. and at 22 to 3 a.m. it sank. USS Vincennes hesitated to open fire, but when it started to receive damaging hits, the order to hold fire was revoked. The captain ordered to increase speed, but she was hit with 2 torpedoes from Chokai and later 1 from Yubari. In total, the Vincennes was hit 74 times, and in return she hit once the Kinugasa, causing moderate damage. However, the precise firing of the Japanese soon put almost all her guns out of action, and the ship was left fighting the fires. The captain ordered to abandon ship at 16 past 2, and the ship rolled over at 10 to 3 a.m., with more than 300 sailors still on board. The destroyers played no major role in the northern engagement. At 16 past 2 a.m., the Japanese fleet ceased fire and moved out of the engagement area. USS Ralph Talbot was intercepted and was hit several times, but was able to escape. At 16 past 2 a.m., Mikawa confronted his staff in order to decide if they wanted to go back and hunt the transport or slip away with the cover of darkness. In the end, they decided to return to base because their ships would need time to regroup, they needed to reload the torpedo, and they did not know if there were any other enemy warship in the area. Keep in mind that the Allied Eastern Group did not participate in the battle, and it was probably not spotted during the day by the Japanese plane. Also, the Japanese ship had spent a big amount of torpedo and on the Allied ship. I don't have clear figure, but this was still considered a factor. However, the most important factor was that hunting the transport will require time, and they would have risk being caught during the daylight near the operational area, therefore under risk of enemy air attack. And no, the Japanese were not aware that Task Force 61 had retreated long before the battle, and since the Japanese were not the industrial power that the US was, they could not risk to take any losses. The last things needed to consider is that Chokai's chart room were destroyed, and being that ship the flagship, my guess is that Mikawa did not want to risk around in enemy waters, having lost the charts and navigational equipment. So at 20 past 2 a.m., Mikawa ordered his ship to return to base. At 5 a.m. it became apparent that the Canberra could not be saved and it was scuttled. This required quite a big Allied effort with 300 shells and 5 torpedoes needed, and this might indicate a misunderstanding of how much the Canberra could still have taken, as it probably could have been saved. Astoria sank at 15 past 12 after her fires went out of control. On the morning of the 9th, the destroyer USS Jarvis, that was badly damaged on an earlier air raid, was sunk with all hands by Japanese planes, after Mikawa's fleet spotted her during the night and mistook it as a light cruiser. By nightfall on the 9th, all Allied ships had left the area, leaving the soldier on Guadalcanal and Tulagi with limited supplies. In total, the Allied lost 4 cruisers sank, 1 damaged, 2 destroyers damaged, and 1 later sank in a follow-up engagement, the USS Jarvis. The Japanese, on the other hand, suffered light damage on some ships, but while returning to base, the heavy cruiser Kako was sunk by the submarine USS S-44 that hit the cruiser with 3 torpedoes, claiming the biggest line warship so far in the war. In total, the Allies suffered 1,077 killed in action and 709 wounded. Most of the deaths were on the Quincy with 370 deaths, Vincennes 332, Astoria 216, and Canberra 85. The Japanese suffered 35 killed and 51 wounded. The sinking of the Kako brought some additional 34 killed and 48 wounded, while the loss of the Jarvis added to the Allied losses 247 deaths. In hindsight, Mikawa should have turned back and finished the transport, as that would have crippled the American advance in the Solomon Islands for a lot of time, but by putting ourselves in the Japanese commander's shoes, it was a clever decision. The American Navy conducted a board inquiry, but it did not impact the careers of most of the protagonists in the fight. The only one affected was Captain Rifkold, who after Savo Island never commanded a ship again. Captain Board of USS Chicago shot himself on the 9th of April 1943 and died the following day. Admiral Turner described why the Allied lost, and to quote him, "The Navy was still obsessed with a strong feeling of technical and mental superiority over the enemy, in spite of ample evidence as to enemy capabilities. Most of our officers and men despised the enemy and felt themselves true victors in all encounters under any circumstances. The net result of all of these was a fatal lethargy of mind which inducted a confidence without readiness, and a routine acceptance of outworn peacetime standard of conduct. I believe that this psychological factor, as a cause of our defeat, was even more important than the element of surprise. The report of the inquiry caused the US Navy to make many operational and structural changes. All the earlier models of US Navy cruisers were retrofitted with emergency diesel electric generators. The firefighting equipment of the ship was changed to a vertical loop design that could be broken many times and still function. During the Battle of Savo, many ships' fire were attributed to aviation facilities which filled with gas, oil, and planes. Motorboats were filled with gasoline and also caught fire. In the American heavy cruiser design, these facilities were dead amidship, presenting a perfect target for enemy ships at night. Ready service lockers, that are lockers containing ammunition that is armed and ready for use, added to the destruction, and it was noted that the lockers were never close to being depleted, meaning that they contained much more dangerous ammunition than they needed to. A focus was put on removing or minimizing flammable amidship material, and this would prove vital to future Allied, especially American, firefighting effort on board of the ship. This battle was a huge moral defeat for the Americans and proved the war that the Japanese Navy might have lost their carriers at Midway, but not have will to fight. This brings an end to our first battle special. I hope you like this, as we have other battle plans planned to cover additionally to our Warfare Room Operation series. If you enjoyed, leave a like and subscribe, and check our website for the sources of the video. Thank you for watching, and remember to always notify your friendly ships if you sight an enemy fleet.